I'm Larry Elliott, the economics editor of The Guardian. Welcome to the last plenary session of this after austerity conference. This session is called Kick-Starting the Recovery, something that we probably wouldn't have thought we'd be having 2.5 years ago, but we're still in the position where we need to think about how to get the economy going again. So I've got 5 people on the panel. On the far left, Lord Robert Skidelsky, biographer of Keynes, eminent biographer of Keynes. To his right, Colin Hay from Sheffield University. On my immediate left, Judith Kirton-Darling from the ETUC. On my right, Jonathan Portes of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. And on the far right, Dean Baker for the Centre for Economic and Policy Research in Washington. Now, what we're going to do here, we're going to try and keep the session as lively as possible. I've asked the panellists to confine their comments to perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, just a brief overview of where they think we are and where we think we need to get to and how we get there. And then I'm going to open it up to some questions from the floor and try and get some sort of discussion going, because I know that by this stage of the day people are getting a bit restless, so we want this to be an interactive session if we possibly can. It's only an hour long, so it should be nice and snappy. If I can ask you please, when you do ask a question, to tell me who you are and your affiliation if you have one, and to keep your question as short as possible, because otherwise we don't get very many questions in and people just give us lectures from the floor, and I will cut people off if they start to bore me. So I'm going to ask Robert to kick us off. If this was the 1930s, which in some respects it is. I mean, the recession here has gone on for long. It's taken long for the economy to recover this time that it did in the 1930s. What would we do? What would Lord Keynes be saying? Would he be saying stick to plan A, or would he be saying time for plan B? Robert.
Thank you very much, Larry. I want to concentrate on 3 topics, and the first is austerity. I assume it's common ground in this audience that the austerity policies have failed in their own terms. I have hopes that even the people who have been implementing them realize this, and it's only the difficulty of burying them without revealing them to be insane, incompetent, or otherwise that actually prevents a swift move to some alternative thing. So let's assume that, let's not talk about that, the pros and cons of austerity. Assume that some sort of recovery will happen in due course, and the question is what sort of economy will come out of it. Now, I think going back to the 30s, taking that as our cue, there was, in the 30s too, there was a demand problem and a supply side problem. Remember, the British economy, which recovered in the 1930s, was to a large extent a new economy, based on mass consumption, light engineering, industries which hadn't existed before the slump. So what would the equivalent transformation be today? And there's much talk about industrial policy. Traditionally, that was discussed in terms of reviving our manufacturing base. The argument, much heard in the 1980s, that we needed a surplus in manufacturing to pay our way, damn this iPad, and to maintain our living standard. What's that?
It's called the new economy.
The new economy. This is a bit of it, yeah. And since services were largely non-tradable, so people like Lord Caldor in the 1980s were predicting catastrophe if we didn't do something to reverse the decline in our manufacturing. Well, the catastrophe hasn't happened, but neither has the economy's performance since then been anything like as good as it was when we did have a substantial manufacturing base and a surplus on our manufacturing exports. So hopes of industrial policy essentially rest on developing a new generation of high-tech industries, I guess. That, of course, means investing more in human capital or education, and above all, getting a much better output from our educational system, per unit of input. And it strikes me that we're absolutely mad in neglecting investment in education to the extent that we have, considering our future as not a world-class economy, but just an economy that can maintain and improve existing standards of living depends on that. And it's so much more important to get quality improvements in education than so-called innovations in financial products. I mean, who was saying just before we went in here that there are now 12,000 different types of mortgages? Honestly. So, a second type of rebalancing argument stresses the distorting influence of our financial services. And this is a rerun of the old city versus industry argument that's run for 100 years or more, with Churchill's remark, "I'd rather see finance less proud and industry more content," thrown in for good measure. Clearly, rebalancing the economy, I think now, should aim to give Britain a more stable portfolio of assets, that is, rebalancing it away from finance, which at the same time gives government a more stable revenue base. Because the problem with the strength of the financial services sector in this country is not so much now, I think, that it invests too much money abroad and not enough in the UK, but that it's a seriously destabilizing factor in the national economy and a destabilizing factor for government revenues. There's no doubt that pre-recession GDP and government revenues were inflated by a credit-led asset boom, so the collapse of the British economy and of government revenues was proportionately greater than it would have been had we had a more balanced economy. Now, that's my last topic. That's my second topic. Now, my last topic, there's less attention has been given, though not, I think, today in earlier sessions of this conference. This arises from the connection between the recent crisis and the lopsided distribution of income and consumption. Over the last 30 years, the gap between the median income and mean or average income has steadily widened. The rich have raced ahead of everyone else, capturing most of the fruits of increased productivity and decanting much of the rest of the workforce into low-paid service jobs or unemployment and underemployment. And I'm always shocked to read that 13 million British households, or 21% of the population, live below the official poverty line of 60% of median income. And the economic result of that, and leave morals aside, the economic result of that is to leave big holes in our consumption economy. A lot of people still don't have enough money for a good life. There's a lot of underconsumption going on relative to what is produced and our capacity to produce it. And in the old days, people used to talk about underconsumption and even further back, poverty in the midst of plenty. And so the question is, how are stagnant earnings to be reconciled with the relentless pressure to consume, which drives production? And so far, the answer has simply been borrow more, more, more. And of course, that lays the seeds for further crises. So we can't go on automating our production, creating more and more technological unemployment, transformed into dead-end jobs, without rethinking our attitudes towards consumption, to work, to leisure, and the distribution of income. Without such efforts of social imagination, recovery from the current crisis will simply be a prelude to more shattering calamities in the future.
Thank you very much. Well, Dean Baker, I mean, lopsided distribution of income and consumption seems to be a feature not just of the UK, but the US as well. But if Ed Balls was here today, he would say US is an example of a country that's getting things right, that some activist policy over there is actually, leading to a faster recovery in the US than it is in the UK. Is he right? Is the US getting it right?
Well, by comparison, the US is getting it right. It's a rather low bar. Just to give you, some perspective, we had, of course, our stimulus package. I made reference to it earlier back in 2009. It was nowhere near large enough. So just to give you, sort of, to my view, at least the basic parameters of our downturn, like the UK, our downturn was driven by a housing bubble, and our bubble has collapsed. Prices have fallen back to their trend level, their pre-bubble level. We lost on the order of 4 percentage points of GDP directly in residential construction. So we had way more residential construction than normal. Because we had so much overbuilding, we now have less than normal. The gap's about 4 percentage points of GDP, roughly $600 billion a year in annual demand. We also lost a huge amount of consumption. Savings rate had basically fallen to zero at the peak of the bubble, 04 to 07, because people had $8 trillion in housing bubble wealth, equity in their home they spent based on that. Since then, savings rate has gone to still a relatively low level, but it's around 5%. That translates, we've lost somewhere in the order of $500 billion in annual consumption demand. On top of that, there was a bubble in non-residential real estate. That also burst in 2008. That cost us about 1.5% of GDP, around $200 billion. State and local governments, because they lost revenue, had to cut back. We lost around $150 billion. The long and short, if we say how much annual demand did we lose, it's around $1.4 trillion. The stimulus is billed as $800 billion. Now, $100 billion of that or so was a technical fix to the tax code, nothing to do with stimulus. They do it every year. We had about $700 billion in stimulus. Now, that's a package spent out mostly over 2009, 2010. Some of that's spent 11 and later years. What does that mean on an annual basis? Our stimulus package, 2009, 2010, was about $300 billion. We were trying to replace $1.4 trillion in lost demand. That's not enough, okay? So, you know, what you could say is we did the right thing with that, not nearly enough. And if you look at the response to the economy, this is almost textbook Keynesianism. So economy's, you know, going through the floor in the winter, you know, fall of 2008, winter of 2009. Stimulus begins to kick in April and May of 2009. We begin to bottom out. We stopped losing jobs by the fall. 2010, we start creating jobs. Okay, things start to look on the right path. But what happens is the stimulus peaks out, I think it was the second quarter of 2010, starts to whittle away, and it's pretty much gone by 2011. There's still some there, but mostly gone. What happens to employment? Well, we see the rate of employment, the rate of economic growth, plunges in the first half of 2011. In fact, the economy grew, I think it was an 0.8% annual rate for the first half of 2011. Coincides almost perfectly with the wearing away, the whittling away of the stimulus. Since then, you know, the economy's grown a little more quickly, somewhere around 2.5% a year. Now, compared to what you're seeing here in the UK, that looks good.
Looks very good.
But, you know, compared to a situation where we're about 6% below potential GDP, we're short around 10 million jobs, that doesn't get us very far. So the basic story, and I tend to think mostly in terms of jobs, we need roughly 100,000 jobs a month just to keep pace with the underlying rate of growth of the labor force. We're doing somewhat better than that through the winter months. You heard a lot of celebrations, or we heard a lot of celebrations. I assume some of that came over here. We averaged job growth, I think it was about 260,000 through December through March. Unfortunately, that was the weather. We had unusually warm weather. Those of us who believe in global warming, you know, we had an unusually warm winter. What that meant was construction projects that would ordinarily stop in the Northeast, Midwest, or wouldn't get started. They continued right through the winter. People who might not otherwise have gone out shopping, gone out for dinner, bought a new car, they did that in those months. That led to a much slower spring. The long and short is, I don't think we have a lot to boast about. We probably are growing about 2.5%. The slowdown we saw the last couple months is artificial, just as the speed up was, that just as the weather led to more rapid growth than was really there than the underlying trend, it led to weaker growth in the spring, because in effect it was borrowed from the spring months. Our underlying rate of growth is probably about 150,000 jobs a month, you know, maybe a hair over 2.5% in terms of GDP. The arithmetic on that, if we're creating 150,000 jobs a month, we need 100,000 to keep pace with the growth of the economy. We're making up our 10 million jobs lost at 50,000 a month, 200 months. So I guess we're doing better than you, but not by very much.
Okay, thank you for that, Dean. Thank you. Okay, Judith, Kirton-Darling, I mean, let me put a proposition to you. In the run-up to the crisis, it was the Europeans who attacked interventionist, it was the Europeans who favoured interventionist policies and attacked laissez-faire Anglo-Saxon capitalism. And yet, post-crisis, it's been the Anglo-Saxon central banks, finance ministers who've been more willing to try unconventional policies. It's been the Europeans who are supposed to sort of believe in intervention that have been the most conservative. What's going on in Europe? What's going on in European policy, do you think, in terms of this, the state of where Europe is? Because quite clearly, something serious is going wrong with the European economy, isn't it?
I think that's an understatement. I think the fact that European leaders will be meeting on Wednesday this week in Brussels to adopt a growth compact just 6 months after they adopted a fiscal compact demonstrates that European leaders also recognise that increasingly they have got it wrong and they don't really know how to find a consensus to get it right. And I think for us in Europe, that's part of the major challenge. But I think it's worth coming back into the crisis a little bit, that we're now 5 years on since the Northern Rock run. We're 4 years since Lehman Brothers. And directly at Lehman Brothers, I think it was clear that European governments responded in the correct manner. You saw large deployment of policies such as short-time work, such as temporary unemployment, to ensure that the workforce stayed close to companies in the short term. Some of the elements which, I mean, earlier this afternoon I was in the panel event on industrial policy, and there's some of the labour market policies which the TUC has highlighted as good elements of an industrial policy agenda. Those policies of holding workers close to companies in the short term. But what we saw was that as we got into 2010, the public deficits, which had been built up through the end of 2008, 2009, were now turning into the problem. And that problem is largely linked to the way that the European Monetary Union has been created, that we have some elements centralised at European level, but not other elements. And one of the key elements for the European trade union movement has been the question of Eurobonds, that as long as you have nationally denominated bonds for different countries, you have no way of halting the speculation in the bond markets, where speculators can move from one country to the next and create these spirals of the crisis which we've seen through the period. If we think about the countries which are in the centre of the crisis today, Spain or others, going into 2008, Spain had a trade surplus. They didn't have a public deficit as such. They were caught out by the crisis because of private debt. They have a problem with private debt. They had an imbalanced economy. But the effect of speculation in the bond markets against the Spanish economy has meant that crisis hasn't been able to be resolved and has intensified even further. And the situation that we find ourselves in today is extremely desperate in a number of countries. Inequality across Europe is rocketing. Inequalities not just in Southern Europe. If I talk to my brothers and sisters in Greece about the situation that they're facing, massive wage cuts, massive collapse in pensions, then that's doubled if you go outside Greece to the situation in the neighbouring countries who are their traditional trading partners, Romania, Bulgaria and elsewhere, where an attempt to maintain comparative advantage has meant that wages have been pushed down throughout. So we're in this extremely destructive cycle of pressure, and currently and up to now, the main focus by European governments in terms of instruments to adapt and to address the crisis has been the traditional 3 Ps, if you like, of the Depression: pay, pensions and the public sector. And across the board, in countries directly within the eye of the storm, if you like, of the crisis, but also in countries which aren't in the eye of the storm and should be promoting demand and promoting consumption, we've seen reduction in those 3 Ps. So we have inside the ETUC, we've been extremely critical for a number of years, right since the beginning of this push for combined and simultaneous austerity. we've been extremely critical of the European economic agenda. We've consistently put forward alternatives, and those alternatives aren't about increasing wages in Germany and reducing wages in Greece to ensure that we come back to a balance, but it's about promoting demand in Germany, promoting wage increases in Germany. It was a good step that the industrial workers in Germany got a big wage increase earlier this year. That's a step in the right direction, the metal workers. But we need to also be seeing an agenda in terms of an investment agenda and an industrial policy agenda for the whole of Europe and for regions across Europe. And therefore, for the European TUC, we are going to the summit this week with a demand that we don't only have a growth compact at European level, but that we have a concrete social compact, that we can't have an agenda, and this is what is now being discussed in Brussels, of deeper economic integration, deeper political integration, without a proper social dimension to the European integration project. We've called for that for a long time. I went back earlier this year, because I was speaking at the Scottish TUC, to the speech that Delors made in the 80s to the TUC, calling for unions to engage in the social project at European level. But it's now that we need to be mobilising to ensure that that social dimension is put on the table at the same time. And therefore, that's the agenda that the European TUC is pushing. I should say, as a closing point, that you can't put all of your eggs in one basket, but we've seen a remarkable change in tone since the French, the Greek, and the German regional elections and the Italian local elections, where suddenly, from having Mario Draghi announce in the Wall Street Journal that the European social model was dead and we should just forget about it, we're now hearing leaders of major countries, François Hollande notably, taking up key trade union demands in terms of this social dimension, in terms of an agenda on good investment like the FTT. It would be very nice if UK left-wing politicians were also as actively defending an agenda such as the financial transaction tax, the Robin Hood tax, but we see a mobilisation developing, recognising that you can't have a growth agenda without having a proper employment and social justice agenda also at European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colin, kickstarting the recovery, where do we go?
Thank you very much. That's always the difficult one, isn't it? Indeed, when I was first invited onto this panel, and I'm very, very pleased to be here in such distinguished company. And actually, before I get to that, I just wanted to say, if I could, it's got almost a kind of a thanks to the TUC and its economic department in particular for the consistency and quality of its economic analysis during and through the crisis, resisting, I think, very loudly almost the kind of the consensus in public policy on austerity and deficit reduction, and challenging a number of its false premises. But the questions I was asked to talk about today are really, can the economy be made to grow again simply through the use of stimulus measures, or is there a need for a more wholesale transformation of the model of growth? Can we kickstart the recovery, and if so, what might do that? And perhaps a subsidiary question, the biggest question of all in a way, to what extent can the old model of growth be resuscitated, or is a new one required? And it's that last one that I want to kind of kick off with. It has implications for whether we can kickstart the economy, I think. I'm very much of the latter camp, so I think that the old model of growth was indeed profoundly compromised. I think it was always profoundly compromised in a sense. I think the crisis exposed it as such, and we need to think about the transition towards something rather completely different. So this is not just a question of restarting or kickstarting an economy which already has a well-functioning engine that has just been turned off. So I think kickstarting is actually the wrong way to look at this. And there's a problem with that. It's a problem of temporality, of timing. it is very, very difficult to make the transition from one model of growth to a completely different model of growth. And the time horizon over which one might make that transition is 2 or 3 decades, not 2 or 3 years. And so in a sense, I think we also need to think about what we will do whilst we're in the process of building an alternative growth model for ourselves. There's a couple of caveats to this, I think. The first one I've mentioned already, growth models are not easily established, especially in economies whose growth model is as broken as I suggest this one is. And secondly, I think it's something that we've not talked about, certainly not yet on this panel. It's about the value of growth itself, or growth per se, or growth on its own. This can also be questioned, I think. It's certainly not the only way to measure the success of an economy. And indeed, in a way, I think Judith's already pointed to this by talking about the need for social compacts as well as economic compacts. But I think there may also be a need for an environmental compact as well. That said, I think, in the short to medium term, we'd all gladly settle for growth, since no growth in one country, as it were, is hardly an appealing prospect. And the danger, the anxiety, I think, is that we might be headed for environmentally unsustainable non-growth, which is the worst of all possible worlds, I think. So for now, I think the focus should be on growth, not least because the transition to environmental sustainability is much better made, I think, from growth than its absence. So what are the impediments to growth which a new growth model would have to deal with? Well, I think there are 3, and I'll be very brief here. The first, I think, relates to monetary policy. The dependence of the old model of growth on private debt increased the sensitivity of demand in the economy, in the British economy, to interest rate movements, and in the process, the threat to growth posed by inflationary pressures. That problem was temporarily suspended through the crisis, and again now perhaps as well in the double dip, but it's plagued the economy since 2007. The Bank of England effectively has been unable to use interest rates to control inflation. This is compounded by a second factor, I think in a way a more important issue for growth in the UK economy. The size of the mortgage and commercial lending rate spreads which opened up during the crisis. Though not much commented upon, these have yet to close up again in the way that interbank lending rates did. In short, it's become more costly to borrow at a given base rate. Or in other words, the monetary authorities in Britain have allowed the banks to pass on a significant part of the cost of their recapitalisation to borrowers, the effect of which has been to suppress both consumer demand and investment in the process. And that makes the transition to a new growth model much more difficult to achieve, because essentially credit is being rationed to those whose investment might generate the growth prospects of this economy in 20 or 30 years. A final factor relates to the difficulty of resuscitating the old growth model, which was based on asset appreciation and equity release to fuel consumption, typically in a rising housing market. The problem here, I think, is long-standing and intergenerational. Sustained house price inflation at 10% per annum over a number of decades was always going to create a crisis of affordability for new entrants into the housing market at some point. That point was brought forward dramatically by the crisis, but it would have been reached anyway. It was an intergenerational problem of affordability, and it's now being compounded by a step-level increase in the cost of mortgage lending over the base rate and the increased levels of personal debt, which will follow the withdrawal of state funding from higher education. But the point is that that would have come to an end at some point anyway. So what could be done? All paths, I think, lead to the inevitable conclusion, the need for an alternative growth model. But even assuming one could be found, I think there are significant problems. Firstly, as I've suggested already, credit is essentially being rationed through punitive interest rates, and this is crowding out investment in the economy. The problem is reinforced by a further factor, the drop in the value of the commercial property against which many commercial credit lines are secured anyway. And taken together, these make it very difficult to envisage the transition to an alternative, say, export-led growth strategy built on the back of private investment, and the past conditions of the public finances make it difficult to imagine that it's going to be based upon public investment, although I think there is a stronger argument for that. There are policy implications, I think, which follow from this. First, if the economy is to be rebalanced, as all the parties talk about, then the government and the Bank of England need to be putting concerted downward pressure on the actual cost of borrowing independently of the base rate in sectors where a clear link to the growth strategy for the economy could be made and substantiated. Second, there is a strong argument to be made for public investment in support of a clearly articulated growth strategy built on identifying and supporting growth in a series of key export-oriented sectors through active industrial policy, through public infrastructure programs and the like. The point is that public investment may be a highly cost-effective way of providing the public goods on which the transition to a new model of growth essentially relies. And there are ways of doing this. I mean, I don't have time to go into this, but we could think about things like hypothecated investment bonds, delivering higher rates of return to investors than general government debt, which could be used to restore and resource a targeted growth strategy by subsidizing the cost of borrowing in sectors seen as strategically significant in the overall growth strategy, as it were. There would be a form of ethical public investment. But there are even some worries here. This is no panacea. Even were manufacturing to grow at 10% per annum for the next 5 years, we would be talking about a growth of employment of probably no more than 1 million, relatively modest figures given the emphasis so often placed on manufacturing and alternative accounts of growth. So this suggests that that kind of a strategy may be part of a growth strategy, but it is not all of it. There are some implications of this too, and I'll finish with this. First then, the reorientation of the British economy around manufacturing is at best a long-term strategy. It may well yield significant dividends over 2 decades or so, but it is unlikely to contribute very significantly to British growth in the short to medium term. And that sadly means that the British economy probably needs to make do, at least in the interim, with something rather more closely resembling the old growth model than would ideally be the case, whilst we prepare and to make the transition to another. And that means also that for now, the British economy cannot do without the contribution of economic output arising from financial services. But it doesn't mean that we should desist from considerations of thinking about how the banks might operate in a different kind of a way. We need to be aware of the crowding out of potential investment by the punitive interest rate premiums currently demanded by commercial lenders, and those interest rates are themselves a product of the covert repoliticization of investment banking by commercial banking. In short, if you like, commercial banking is subsidizing investment banking in a way that impairs the capacity to build a new growth model. That suggests, I think, a refocusing of the public assault on the banking sector, and that kind of process is long overdue. But my overall point, I think, is that Britain has lost a growth model. All the parties, in a sense, agree on that. It's yet to find one, an alternative one, and the transition to one, if it could be found, would take a considerably long period of time. It's really that bad, and it's bound to get worse before it gets better. Sorry.
Thank you. On that cheery note, Jonathan Portis, today's public finance figures suggest that the deficit is higher this year than last year, and it suggests that Plan A is not perhaps working as well as it might do. What are the prospects for getting the economy going, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think my views on fiscal policy are reasonably well known and probably shared by most people here, so I'm not going to repeat them. And of course, Robert has been writing and talking about this for far longer than I have, and I broadly agree. So, I mean, in the short term, what's needed is, I think, reasonably obvious. And I would merely say that the government has actually essentially conceded the argument. When you start talking about, as the Chancellor and Prime Minister have very explicitly over the past couple of months, about the need to give government guarantees for private sector investment, whether in housing, energy, or whatever. Economically, that is simply a recognition that demand is too low, there are unutilized resources, human and other, that a means needs to be found to channel excess private sector savings into investment. Frankly, whether you do that by borrowing directly or by using some sort of off-balance sheet accounting trick in order to guarantee that borrowing is neither here nor there from an economic perspective. So in my view, the economic argument is over. The government has admitted explicitly that what we need now is more demand, particularly investment demand. So I'm not going to talk about that at length. It's probably more interesting if I pick up on a bit of what Colin said and disagree a bit and give a slightly more positive perspective. So I don't think that everything was wonderful in the UK growth model, but actually the glass, in my view, is at least half full. We saw per capita GDP grow in this country over the last 30 years, including this recession and the last one, both of which were pretty nasty, but including those periods, faster than the US, faster than Germany, faster than France. That is not a bad performance. We're doing pretty well. And that growth was not illusory. To the extent that there was some excess growth in the financial sector, it wasn't because the growth wasn't there, it was largely because that growth was stolen from other bits of the economy. The economy was producing what it was producing. And I highly commend, for those who haven't seen it, the paper by John Van Rieden and Dan Corrie, my former colleague in government, on this, about UK economic performance under particularly the last government, but actually going back 30 years. On the whole, we have run the supply side of the economy reasonably well in the UK for most of the last 30 years. So, in my view, what's needed over the medium term, once we get over the short term, is to build on the successes. And let me just say what I think the successes are. We've had a pretty successful competition policy and regulation of product markets policy that has generated gains for consumers and given us more efficient companies. We've had a pretty successful labour market, a set of labour market policies. Employment in the 2000s was at its highest level for any sustained period in British recorded economic history, as far as I can tell. A greater proportion of the population had jobs than ever before. And that relatively good performance has been continued, actually, during the recession. If you'd asked me, or any other economist, I think, who works on labour market issues 3 or 4 years ago, to say, well, suppose actually there's no recovery and that output in 2012 is still 4% below what it was at the peak in 2008. What's going to happen to unemployment? Some of us would have said 3 million, some of us would have said 3.5 million, some of us would have said 4 million. Nobody, and I mean nobody, would have said 2.7 million. So that level, and you'll know from my writings, I think that level is far too high and reflects very badly on current economic policy. But nonetheless, it is a hugely positive surprise, which reflects well on British labour market, British workers, and British companies. What are the weaknesses? What do we need to do better? I think Robert is absolutely right that education and human capital are the, if we want to be prosperous in 10, 20, 30 years, that is the key area. I would merely elaborate by saying the issue there in particular is educational performance for the bottom half. We do quite well by the 50% or so of the population who are going to go on to higher education. And we have a university sector which, despite everything that governments of both parties have thrown at it, is actually still a world leader. We have done very badly by that half of the population who are not going on to university, and we have to do much, much better in future, and that is a huge failure of governments over at least the last 30 years. We do pretty badly in management in this country. Another thing that my colleague John Van Rienen at LSE has established, we have a long tail of poorly managed companies in a way which some other better performing countries don't do. And I think the point that Colin made that I really do agree with is on the damage done by excessively high house prices in this country. And what can we do about that? Well, it's blindingly obvious that what we need to do in the short term is put more government money one way or the other into building houses, particularly social housing. In the medium term, what we need to do is to reform our planning system so that we can free up the land that we need to build the houses that our population needs. That would have huge benefits in the short term and in the long term, and it would have benefits which are both social and economic and will actually reduce some of the distortions in the macroeconomy. Moving on, we need to work out what we're good at. Colin said, well, boosting the share of manufacturing in the economy is a 20-year ambition. I don't think that anyone seriously believes that manufacturing is going to be a bigger share of the economy, either as output and certainly not as in employment in 10, 15, 20 years in this country. That is a pipe dream. We need to ensure that we will have some high-tech manufacturing. There are some things we're very good at. But more broadly, we need to ensure that we are successful in tradable service sectors, that we produce things that the rest of the world wants to buy and that we can sell them at a reasonable price. That means some of that is finance, but as other speakers have said, it's a very different and much reformed financial sector. But it's also things like higher education, the creative industries, business services, pharmaceuticals, the health service and health products. There are lots of things that this country is actually very good at producing and which are likely to be growth industries in the world economy over the next 10, 20 years. What we need is a set of strategies, which I would not describe as an industrial strategy because that seems to have the wrong flavor, but a set of strategies which will support growth, productivity and employment in those sectors. And that ranges, and this is why I don't call them industrial strategies, such from things like immigration policy, where we see the bizarre spectacle of the Minister for Immigration saying that a fall in British exports is a policy success because we have fewer students coming to this country to study. Completely mad. Similarly, it means working out what it is we make our health service not only more productive and better able to deliver services for us, but to use the huge advantages we have from a centralized or semi-centralized single payer, single provider NHS to create export markets and export sectors, that we use the advantage we have from the English language and from all the graduates that we turn out in arts and related sectors to take advantage of our clear advantage in the creative industries. Everything from producing reality television, which people may not like, but the fact is it creates jobs and earns us quite a lot of money. Everything from reality television to architecture. These are things we're good at. These are things we can continue to be good at and which will be growth industries. So I think we don't need a new growth model, we need a new set of growth strategies, both in the short and the long term.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Right, we've got a little over 15 minutes, so I'm going to take a sort of bundle of 2 or 3 questions together for the panel. The lady over there was the first with her hand up, so I'm going to take you, the lady in purple, I think it is, if my fashion sense has not betrayed me. And there's a gentleman there. And there's a gentleman there. Have we got some mics somewhere? Okay, there's a lady here who needs a mic. And there's a gentleman over there. Can you tell us who you are, please, madam?
Carol Wilcox of the Labour Land Campaign. I'd like to ask the panel, really, whether they predicted the crisis. I know somebody who predicted it precisely, okay? Fred Harrison, boom bust, house prices, banking, and the depression of 2010. He actually predicted the crisis, the previous crisis and this one in 1983 in Power in the Land. This is a land issue. You need to sort out the land. The land market is broken. It does not allocate to best use. And the only way to tackle that is to tax all land rent.
Okay, thank you. Sir, there, if you can pass that mic on to the chap at the end with the end of the. I think he's got his hand up. Yeah. Well, I'll take your question, sir.
George Hallam, Lewisham People Before Profit and Greenwich University. I'm an economist and I predicted 5 of the last 2 recessions. Lessons of the 1930s.
Let's make them nice and short. The lessons be nice and short.
As I understand it, what we did was devalue and slap on massive great tariffs. And as a result, Britain escaped the worst of the world recession of the 1930s. So we've heard a lot of talk, but we have about measures, but nothing about protectionism, tariffs, and devaluation.
Okay, thank you very much. You, sir, and then I get you up.
Yeah, John Kaler. touching on something that Robert Skidelsky mentioned, to what extent does this concentration of wealth, increasing concentration of wealth and income at the top end of society, and also in very few hands, this actually distorts the economy in a dysfunctional way, in the sense that it sucks in imports, reduces demand, reduces employment, factors like that.
Okay. Right. I'll take those. If the panel are nice and short in their answers, we can get a few more in if we can. Who would like to... Well, who's brave enough to say they predicted the recession? Did you? You predicted the recession.
In the U.S., though, not the U.K. 2002, I wrote a paper about the housing bubble. Is it real or is it another bubble? And I said that Fannie and Freddie were likely to face serious trouble, if not collapse. I got a lot of people laughing at me. It was funny at the time, I guess. Anyhow, so yeah, I will take credit on that. I mean, it was predictable, I thought. We had house prices that were clearly out of line with long-term trends with nothing in the fundamentals to support it. So yeah, it looked to me pretty predictable.
Okay. Maybe, Colin, about the land argument. You've talked about the structural problems of the economy, talked about the mortgage market. There is a long-standing strain of thought that says that the dysfunctionality of the UK housing market has got something to do with the need for a land tax. That would be a way of addressing the problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me pick up the first point about predicting this. I mean, I think anyone who wrote on the housing market in the late 1990s, early 2000s did predict it, because it was the sources of instability here were stark. I mean, essentially, Britain relied on a low interest rate, low inflation equilibrium. As soon as that was punctured, then this was going to crash in the way in which it did. And there's a massive literature on this, actually, very considerable literature on it. So I don't think it was terribly difficult to predict. It was only difficult to predict if one employed, as it were, equilibrium assumptions about the way in which the economy operates and the models which sustained that. So as long as one has a notion of disequilibrium, then I don't think this was terribly difficult to predict. But actually, I mean, can I just pick up at the 1930s point very quickly? Just very.
I was going to ask Robert.
Well, and we should ask.
I will ask him, but yeah.
But I just think kind of devaluation and protectionism. Let's try and fix this in a way which doesn't pass the burden of cost of adjustment onto other people first. Let's try and fix it domestically rather than pass the costs onto other people.
I mean, Robert, the question was right, isn't it? That Britain did actually devalue first, came from the gold standard first, and did slap on its imperial preference. That was part of the answer, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I agree with that comment. And we have the interesting thing now is we have devalued about 25% against other currencies, but we still haven't closed the current account deficit. It's always easy to predict crises, but it's the date of the crises that are difficult. And that was George Soros's problem. There are too many intervening variables. He thought there'd be a crisis in the 1990s, then came along the dot-com revolution, and so that started to justify the exaggerated house prices. And the last thing, how does concentration of wealth and income distort the economy? Yes, it does. I mean, it produces underconsumption. And Karl Marx was very good on this. Karl Marx should be read. He should be read. He's not the hoary old has-been that we thought of him a few years ago, and he predicted the crisis of realization that would follow from concentration of income in few hands.
Jonathan, I'll ask you a question. Jonathan, the point that made about concentration of wealth, does it matter that the growth that we saw, you talked about the growth we saw in the UK economy the last 20, 30 years, better than Germany, better than the US, better than France, did it matter that quite a lot of that was concentrated at the very top of the income district? All the gains of that growth were actually cleaned up by the people at the very top?
Oh, well, it certainly matters from a moral perspective, and it matters in the sense, in a medium to long-term sense, in terms of the transmission of inequality through generations. But what I don't think is that money was in some sense illusory, and that we can't have those rates of growth. We just need to find a way of having those rates of growth with a more equitable and economically rational distribution of income. Okay.
Can I come on that point?
Yeah, you come back. There's a specific question I want to ask you afterwards. But
okay. Yeah. No, I think in terms of the increasing concentration of wealth, one of the effects that it has had is to create this footloose flow of capital which is looking for quick returns, which has also fed the speculative bubbles that we've seen, and it's feeding the speculation that we see in Europe. And I think that's an extremely socially destructive byproduct of this income inequality. And I think the other interesting thing is that it's obviously striking when you look at the UK or the US, and they're the classic cases. But even in Europe's most kind of socially cohesive countries like Sweden, that growth between rich and poor has been rising rapidly. And at the moment, we see a difference of something like the difference between the top 50 incomes to an average worker, industrial workers' collective agreement is about 46 times, which is the average working life of an industrial worker in Sweden. So we're seeing that rise of inequalities across the board, and that's why it's so essential that whatever comes out in terms of solutions to the crisis, a new model or new growth strategies, that integrated into those strategies have to be tackling these basic inequalities, which were really the root causes of much of this crisis and haven't been addressed really. And part of addressing that is re-regulation of the financial markets. And unfortunately, since Pittsburgh in 2009, we've seen hardly any re-regulation of the financial markets internationally.
Judith, just a question I'll ask you about Europe. I mean, there are really only sort of 4 logical ways forward for Europe, aren't there? One is you can have austerity. You can have austerity for quite a long time so that the poor countries get their costs down and they become more competitive. 2, you can have a system of transfers, big transfers across Europe from rich countries to poor countries, so that the richer countries essentially subsidise the poorer countries and help them out with their competitiveness problem on a permanent basis. And thirdly, the Germans can, or the richer Northern European countries can have higher rates of inflation, 5% maybe, so that the poorer countries can have 1% inflation but not have massive austerity. Or 4, that some of the weaker countries can leave. I mean, which of those 4 paths do you think Europe is going to go down?
Okay, I didn't predict the crisis, and I'm not necessarily going to predict what will be the result in Europe. I think from a union perspective...
What would the union prefer then?
The union, the ETUC, wants to see the Eurozone stay together. The exit of members from the Eurozone will have really catastrophic effects in terms of employment and social conditions, not just in the countries which leave the Eurozone, but also in the whole of the Eurozone.
Okay, here's a follow-up.
And so I think if from that list, the preference would be that we convince the Germans to accept a higher rate of inflation. But with history, I mean, we talk about the 1930s in the UK, or the build-up to the Great Depression. Obviously, in Germany, there's a very large psychological barrier to increasing inflation.
So here's a question for all 5 panellists. Do you think the Eurozone will continue in its current form as 17 countries, yes or no? Do you think it's going to survive as 17 countries?
The current 17?
Current 17, yeah.
I think it's becoming more difficult by the day.
Okay.
There needs to be an urgent solution if we're going to survive with 17.
Okay. Dean, do you think it's going to survive?
Not the current 17.
So how many do you think are going to go?
Well, Greece.
Greece is going to go. Jonathan?
I agree with Judith.
Yeah. Colin?
I think it depends on political will. I don't think it can be predicted at this point, actually. I think
That's a sort of maybe then. It's not
except it's to argue that it's a political point, not an economic point, I think. It is not impossible that Greece can stay. I think it's unlikely because I don't think the political will to maintain Greece there will be maintained, but I think it can be, and I think it's important to say that.
Robert?
Greece should leave.
Can I go back to currencies for a second?
Can you? I'm going to take a few more questions. You can come back to the... Okay, come on then.
I'll be real quick.
Quick.
I just strongly agree with the point on currencies. I mean, that is what's supposed to happen when you have a trade deficit. Your currency is supposed to fall, and wealthy countries are supposed to be exporting capital, not importing capital. So this is kind of textbook. Now, it doesn't have to happen today, but that should happen. The flip side of that is if you have a trade deficit, you either have a public sector deficit or private sector deficit. That's an accounting identity. And most people don't seem to want big public sector deficits unless you want households to have negative savings as you've had, then you want balanced trade or something closer to it. That's accounting identity. So you either believe in accounting or identities or don't. Those are 2 schools of economics.
Gentleman there. You, sir, yeah. You with your right hand up. Yes, you, yeah. And the glasses. Yeah. You need a mic, yeah. Otherwise we'll never hear you. Who else? There's a gentleman in the front row. And there's a gentleman here. I think this is going to have to be the last 3.
Thanks. Pratik Butch from the Social Liberal Forum. Is what we need
going forwards after austerity, a progressive, green, left-leaning Mont Pelerin society.
More what, sorry?
Mont Pelerin society.
Okay.
Larry, you called for one at the IPP about 4 years ago. Nothing seems to... should we just set up a Bloomsbury society?
All right, Mont Pelerin, okay. Goes back to 1947, I think, doesn't it? You say, yeah.
Gerald Newsom, Musicians Union. Jonathan, I was delighted to actually hear you talk about some good news, and which was one of the industries, which of course is the creative industries, which is actually very much expanding and becoming a major factor of the UK import situation. My question to you is that one of our great problems is piracy, intellectual property and piracy. And with the emergence of a country like China, with its huge potential for consumer, how are we going to police that for the benefit of the UK or the benefit of the global economy in general? How do we police intellectual privacy of patents, copyrights, etc.?
Okay, good. There's a gentleman there, and if he's quick, we might take a couple more. So there are 5 questions for the 5 panelists. There's a lady over there. I'll take in the orange because I can see orange with my poor eyesight. You, sir, go on.
Paul Noon, Prospect the Union, not the magazine. The British government has been very successful with its basic argument that the nation's maxed out its credit card and that there's no alternative, therefore, to the present spending cuts. And that is generally supported by the British public. Opinion poll after opinion poll has shown that. Why is that? Is it the absence of an effective alternative, or do the British people just like pain?
Okay. Yeah, okay. There's a lady in orange in the middle at the back there.
Thanks very much. Leslie Mercer from the Charter Society of Physiotherapy. The overall level of unemployment might not be quite as high as some economists have predicted, but I think the level of youth unemployment is an absolute tragedy. What, in a nutshell, does the panel think we can do to get more young people back to work?
Okay, one more. There's a gentleman there in the purple tie, mauve tie, not purple.
Just a very quick one. Making an assumption for a second.
Who are you, sir?
Sorry, Nick Hales, Prospect again. What might happen if Mitt Romney gets elected?
Okay. Right. Well, Dean, that's obviously set up for you. What would happen if we'll ask one question to each panelist. Mitt Romney, what would happen if he got elected in the US?
You know, there's at least a 50-50 chance that Romney would be our best hope for serious stimulus. And I say that in all seriousness because if you look at the precedent of Republican presidents, they don't tend to care about deficits. Ronald Reagan came in, big tax cuts, huge deficits. George W. Bush, big tax cuts, large deficits. Also, the wars helped to fuel that. I think it's entirely possible. They yell about deficits now. I think they don't really care about it. I think there's at least a 50-50 chance we'll see the big tax cuts, no offsetting spending cuts, and that would actually be a boon to growth.
Okay, bring him on.
Bring him on. I'm going to be his Treasury Secretary.
Jonathan, there's a specific question there about creative industries. How much, you mentioned how strong our creative industries are. I mean, to what extent are they at threat by
intellectual? Well, first of all, I should say this is well beyond my expertise. This is a very technical area in economics in which I'm not a specialist. And there is a big trade-off in patents and intellectual property. You want to encourage innovation. You want to preserve people's property rights. On the other hand, you don't want to stifle. You don't want to let people sort of corner the market in particular things. So, but on the sort of political economy, my assumption that is, as China becomes more and more engaged in the world economy and not just a supplier of cheap low-cost goods, it will be in their interests to play by whatever rules are collectively agreed. So I think in the long term, this seems to me a transitional problem. There clearly is a major problem at the moment, but I suspect that that if we engage China, and if China can develop in a way, which is another big question on which I'm not a specialist, is the future development of the Chinese economy. If Chinese economic development continues to be relatively successful, and we can integrate them into the global system, then this too should fall into place.
Okay. Judith, maybe you'd like to take the question about youth unemployment. What's the ETUC doing about youth unemployment? Obviously in some European countries it's high here, but it's 50% in Greece, 50% in Spain. I mean, huge social problem.
Absolutely, and I think the questioner was absolutely right that whereas unemployment across the board is a problem, youth unemployment is really a catastrophe. at the moment across the EU. Also, as I said, in terms of inequality, that runs also for youth unemployment. So even countries which are doing okay and faring okay in the crisis are seeing much higher than average youth unemployment figures. What's the ETUC calling for? We have a clear demand for a youth guarantee at European level, which would be a legal right for young workers to have a proper apprenticeship, education opportunity or job within 4 months of unemployment. That's being negotiated together with the Commission and the Parliament and the employers at European level, because youth unemployment represents a major challenge also for industry. Industry's facing major skills gaps already of how to ensure that there aren't big gaps in a few years where when the baby boom generation fully retires. So that's one side, and that may sound as if it's a bit of a pipe dream, but we have to think that within the European budget we have a lot of money which has not been spent, because the European money depends, if anybody's been involved in a European project you'll know this, that you have to have co-financing and counter-financing for money. So what we're demanding is that that unused EU money be used specifically for youth employment programmes across Europe. And that links into an agenda in terms of investment, in terms of the promotion of greening of skills, the promotion of investment in projects such as the example of energy efficiency in the construction sector, where we've seen from the German experience that investing a very small amount of public money can create a lot of jobs very quickly, not only in the construction sector, but in all of the allied trades and industries. And those jobs offer an opportunity for young people to get into the labour market and to get the first step on the ladder. So it's a question of joining up policies, linking it with where we want to get to in the end, which is an agenda linking to the environmental agenda, as was said, and the agenda in terms of transformation of our housing stock, our building stock, energy and transport infrastructure, but linking that with apprenticeships and opportunities for young people. And we're actively pursuing that in as many ways as we can. It's pretty much the #1 priority for the ETUC at the moment.
Excellent.
They're our future members, we hope, and therefore we have to defend their interests as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're rapidly running out of time. Two more questions, really. I'd like you, Robert and Colin, first to take one of these. Colin, I mean, you talked about sort of rebuilding a new economy. The question about Mont Pelerin is interesting. I mean, that was a sort of really sort of foundation of the whole sort of free market think tank movement post-war. Hayek was there, von Mises was there. I mean, all the great luminaries who became the sort of great thinkers of the free market right were there. I mean, has the left suffered? This is a big question, too big for this. Suffered from not having an coherent intellectual answer to that during this crisis? Do you think? And what can be done about it? Because it's quite
I think to some extent it has, but I think actually we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the ideas are there. I mean, Lord Skidelsky talked very eloquently about the role that Keynes and a Keynesian imaginary might play in leading us to reconceptualize this as a crisis of growth rather than a crisis of debt. I mean, the point about Mont Pelerin, I think, is very interesting. I think you yourself said it was 1947. Yeah. 1947 to 1979 is quite a long period of time. We don't have that long. We didn't have a leftist Mont Pelerin in a way, so I think actually we've got to make use of what we already have, but I think there's quite a lot there actually. I mean, I think if we listen to what Lord Skidelsky said, if we listen to some of the other ideas here, and in the end I think Jonathan and I probably agree on a lot about what could be done to make things better. There is actually quite a lot here. What we need are parties that are potential carriers for these ideas, that are prepared to think the big thing, and to say that it really is pretty badly broken and we need some rather fundamentally different ideas to put on the table. I hope they have the courage of their conviction.
Robert, feel free to come up and answer any of that, but I'd particularly like to answer the question about, are we just essentially, masochists here? That we've got sort of contracting private sector debt, and the government is obviously trying to get rid of its debt at the same time. Is it, obviously this is not exactly textbook economics. Is it because we're just crazy, or is it because we're...
Well, I think the rhetoric of cuts is supported, not the actual cuts. And the reason the rhetoric cuts are supported, it sort of stems from old Puritan guilt about getting into debt. And therefore, when people talk that language, people say, yes, that's what I learned. And, you know, they feel guilty about it. But I don't think they like the actual cuts. When it hits them, they don't like it. On the Pellerin, you know, all these societies, and you can mention the IEA, they were all funded by a very rich person who had a single idea. And the single idea was there's too much government, get it out of things. And I mean, that was a powerful single idea. The left never had, well, it did once, had a simple idea, which was to get the government into as many things as possible. But once that was exploded, it's been left sort of in a bit of an intellectual void. But the most important thing is it needs a billionaire. And then you can get a left-leaning, more Pellerin society.
Anybody in the audience, please come forward at the end.
Soros.
We had George Soros.
We had George Soros. Okay, even millionaires. Right, I'm afraid that brings this session to an end. We are going to have some closing remarks from Brendan Barber, the General Secretary of the TUC, so I'd ask you to wait. In the meantime, can I just thank all 5 panellists for a really great session.